Hello, everyone. Welcome to Philosophy15. I am Robert Talisse.
I'm Scott Aikin.
These are 15-minute unscripted philosophy conversations among the co-authors of this here book, Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement. We're going to round out a trio of discussions of pluralism by picking up on a theme that's been pretty central to our collaborative work as academics, where over a decade ago now, Scott and I floated, argued for, defended, and defeated all comers with a thesis that pragmatists can't be pluralists. Wanted to set up the...
How's that argument work? First off, it's totally surprising. In not only in 2005, it was a surprising thesis. It seemed like it was a truism held among pragmatists. And even today, a lot of folks act as though our thesis is obviously false, but no one's actually given a decent argument for it, but despite the bluffs and so on. However, so the argument is effectively that, look, pluralism starts from a handful of theses. One of them a kind of an epistemological thesis, namely that there are disagreements that reason doesn't look like reasons can get to the bottom of. The epistemological thesis can come in kind of two strengths. It looks like the first one is the strong epistemological thesis that it's impossible. Right? It's not,
principle.
In principle, right? You might say it's not an epistemic possibility for us that we can have a solution to this. Because why? Because we've just thought about the nature of value. The second one is just a sort of a weaker one, which is it doesn't look like we have the resources now.
Cognitive resources.
Cognitive resources to get to the bottom of it. So, right, as an epistemological thesis, it's got to be just about cognitive resources. So it looks like pluralisms can come along two strengths like that. It looks like pluralism also is a kind of an ontological thesis about the ontology of values, namely that you might say that there's a deep heterogeneity to values, that they don't either share either a sort of a ground floor of value, that they're not manifestations of a sort of a deeper one, or that you might say they're not on the way to a greater one down the road, right? That you might say that there's not a downstream or upstream value that you might say that they're all manifestations of or on the way to. And so given those two features of pluralism, it looks like pragmatism is inconsistent with those requirements for what pluralism is. Because pragmatism, either as a thesis about meaning or about inquiry, has got to be inconsistent with those two views, with any of those instances of those views. This was the core element of the paper, which was, if pragmatism is a thesis about meaning, the way you analyze conflicting meanings is in terms of a strategy for being able to find something to make it such that they're commensurable. That's what the practical reduction of philosophical problems with, for example, James is. And so, on the other hand, if pragmatism is a thesis about inquiry, that namely that we should never block the way of inquiry, then as a consequence, of course pluralism would be inconsistent with pragmatism because as a thesis, certainly the strongest version of epistemological pluralism would be inconsistent with the view that inquiry is something that we should never block. The view that inquiry is impossible in cases of value is inconsistent with the thought that we should never block the road of inquiry. That's the block.
Right, and in fact, you want to say, just think about classical, well, at least the James and Dewey versions of classical pragmatism.
Yeah.
Take it that long-standing philosophical disputes among two potential explanations or two categories, if it looks like inquiry, we can't think of a way in which inquiry can resolve the dispute. That's taken in James and Dewey both as proof that it's a pseudo problem.
That's right.
That the categories are messed up.
That's right.
Like you look at the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem has been a problem for a couple hundred years. Nobody seems to. Not only don't we seem to be making progress, we can't even think about what it would take to make progress. There's no way to conceive of what could inquiry do that would count as a resolution. That's the argument for thinking that the categories are false. Right? That the whole problem has to be aufgehoben, right? The whole problem has got to be gotten away with. But the pluralist thesis is inconsistent with that metaphilosophical...
Those have got to stay in place, right? You might say pluralism is to say, no, those disagreements are so deep that you can't ever get past them. The pragmatist line is, no, the fact that you can't get past them means that they're misconceived.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
This looks like just such a home run argument, by the way.
For the classical pragmatist, countenancing any conflict or debate or dispute or choice between options that is invulnerable to amelioration, resolution, through inquiry, through continuing experience in James's case, that is constitutive of pseudo-problematicity. That's constitutive of something's being a pseudo-problem for the James and Peirce line.
Yeah.
Done.
And so there's a lot of other metaphilosophical things that arise out of that. But effectively, this is that's the core element of the argument. Now, we got a lot of pushback to this argument, and some of them were pretty well considered. For example, one argument was that, pragmatism is a view about, you might say, policy monism, right? You might say that it's that, or you might say policy rationalism with regards to these, that
at least anti-pluralism,
policy anti-pluralism, that being able to rationally resolve these disputes is something that you have to, you might say, have a hope in, right? And so it's something that you have to proceed on the basis of. So you have to, you might say it's your defaults or something like that. But pragmatism doesn't guarantee that the metaphysical thesis and the deep epistemological thesis are false, right? So this well-considered came from Cheryl Mesack. So this was the best reply to our argument, which was
to date the
best reply to our argument.
One of the few actual replies, by the way.
Yeah, this seemed to be.
We don't have to get more snarky than that.
I wanna, but all right. I'll follow your good example, Rob, and not getting snarky. So we'll stick with the Mesack objection because it's actually Mesack's objection that's prompted us to modify the thesis. And the modified thesis is really focused on the epistemological elements of the pluralist view.
Right. It should be clear that the metaphysical pluralist view is just a no-go for the pragmatist. Right. It's got to be a no-go for the pragmatist because it looks Platonist in its value ontology. Right. It looks like it's another instance of putting metaphysics first and practice second. It looks like it violates all the pragmatist rules for philosophy and has, it's called metaphysical pluralism for a reason, and has all of the ontological commitments and metaphysical baggage that pragmatists, about everything else, are in the business. The business of jettisoning.
Yeah, absolutely. So it looks like the metaphysical elements of pluralism are absolutely a no-go for pragmatist metaphysics. But the epistemological elements are ones that it looks like the pragmatist can countenance, but whenever things are properly modified. So what we've been calling it is weak epistemological pluralism.
Or modest. Let's call it modest.
Modest,
yeah,
right.
Weak makes it sound like we don't like it.
Yeah, like we don't like it, right. So, there are other connotations to that. So the more modest versions are that, again, to acknowledge that there are value disagreements that we can't resolve. However, the prohibition against the rational resolution of these disagreements, you might say, as we called it in the last video cast, punting on second down phenomenon, the pragmatist has got to be against that with regards to it. And so the punting on second down phenomenon is, it looks like we got a really hard problem. Well, it must be rationally resolvable. Flip a coin or something like that. That can't be a pragmatist view. And so this more keeping your thumb on the sort of the inclination, or keeping your thumb and trying to tamp down, you might say, the the inclination to think that because the issue is really hard to get to the bottom of, it must just be something that human beings are deeply incapable of, and maybe because of the nature of the values that have come to us that we can't get to the bottom of it. Keeping that at bay is the element of this modest epistemological pluralism that is, in fact, consistent with pragmatism.
Right. So it's the thesis that cases of long-standing value conflict that we do not know how to proceed with or what a resolution could look like might yet be cases of contingent
Right.
conflict.
That's right.
Might yet be cases of contingent conflict, really hard moral problems that require further inquiry. But the modest epistemological pluralist position is willing to just leave it at a maybe.
Right.
Right.
So what makes it pluralist then?
Well, here's what makes it pluralist.
Yeah. Right. So what makes it pluralist then? You'd say, well, because any monist could say this too.
No,
right?
no. Well, hold on.
They can say the modest thing. They can say like, look, don't give up. It looks like your default should be set on it, that it's rationally resolvable. Why? What makes this a pluralist view?
Because I think that the modest epistemological pluralist is willing to will not assert what the monist must.
That's right.
The monist has to say that long-standing value conflict with no third value that looks like the appropriate place to look for commensuration or resolution is evidence that something is askew in your conception of the values in conflict.
They've got to be in principle committed to the fact that the conflicts are merely conflicts.
That's right. And that the long-standingness, the durable resistance to resolution by means of ongoing inquiry is, for the monist, evidence that you've misconstrued the values in conflict.
Right.
The modest epistemological pluralist simply is a pluralist insofar as he passively rejects, declines to assert, goes quietist about what the monist has to say.
Yeah.
Every time you try to resolve that conflict and fail to resolve it, you've got a piece of evidence that you've misconstrued the values that are in play. You need a conceptual reworking, not more inquiry. That's what's pluralist about it.
So everything about this depends on us then being committed to the fact that there's got to be something robust to and different from negation. Declining to, right? It's like,
that's right.
You're not denying the monist view.
That's
you're
right.
declining to assent to. What exactly is the content of that cognitive attitude?
Good. Well, perfect.
I've been playing with this idea for a long time, and
But isn't that
really
what makes modest epistemological pluralism ripe for the pragmatist? Pragmatism
for inquiry.
Pragmatism is the thesis that there is a difference between. Yeah. Not asserting and denying. That is part of the...
And it's a practical difference.
That is the pragmatist... That is the core of the pragmatist metaphilosophy, isn't it?
Yeah.
The idea of... the quietism is some space in between asserting and denying.
Yeah, and
is a
kind of so yeah, it's a kind of Wittgensteinian trope. It's a mitigated skeptical trope.
Right. Yeah. But notice
there's a kind of an epoche element to it,
and it's got a. So if this is a pragmatism, or it's consistent with pragmatism. Notice the claim isn't that pragmatists have to be modest epistemological pluralists. The claim is not that modest epistemological pluralism is a uniquely pragmatist thesis. It's that pragmatists can adopt this.
Right.
Right.
We've just argued for consistency, not necessity or entailment
or anything. That's right. But notice that part of what's being claimed now is that, and maybe this is on some versions of pragmatism, this is a pragmatist thought, not on all, that we are, in some sense of the word, required to pursue the completion of something that we have reason to think might not be completable. That's what inquiry is on the
Yeah.
Peircean view.
That's right.
You've got to strive for the end of inquiry, even though you've got reason to think
You can only make
one.
negative progress, not
Right.
positive.
Philosophy 15, folks. Thank you. See you next time.